Okay, now we're all
Okay,
right.
all right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us for our talk today. And I will be discussing traditional nonprofits are not today's solution. So, one of the things that I'm most passionate about is starting my own nonprofit that fosters human centered connections within communities through community engaged events and research. And we've been around since 2017 and have facilitated various events reaching 390 members in various communities. And those events have ranged from in person as well as virtual. In our wheelhouse, our first program was Family Flickin', which is a pop up movie experience in communities that lack a movie theater. Our Dare to Dialogue series is an opportunity to have conversations about challenging topics, and we primarily have done that initiative in an in-person environment. Our newest endeavor is embarking upon community engaged research, where we currently have grant funding to support a needs assessment of African American women living in poverty stricken areas within Cincinnati to further understand stress, coping, and mental health support needs. So before embarking upon this journey, I spent a lot of time within the nonprofit sector in many different roles, starting out as a program developer, grant writing, community outreach coordinator, case manager, internal program evaluation and researcher, and now CEO and president of CEC. And so within each of these experiences, I've taken various insights that has really helped me to think about the nonprofit sector a little bit differently. And so, nonprofits in general, when you look at how the IRS classifies them, the main two classes within 501c3s are private foundations versus public charities. And then within that, you have churches, hospitals, education, arts, culture, a plethora of various nonprofits. It's actually really hard to gauge how many nonprofits are actually in existence because not all of them are necessarily required to file. And that's just due to the sizes and various operating budgets. And so within the traditional organizational structure of a nonprofit, you have the CEO, president, executive director, who is reporting to the board. And under that, you may have a chief operating officer, a chief financial operating officer, a director, a manager. Then further goes a case manager or a coordinator. And what's interesting about the nonprofit structure, it's similar to a business structure. And so a lot of times you'll have people that were in the for-profit sector coming over to the nonprofit sector to integrate various business practices within. So when you think about what's going on today, what issues matter today? And so what we're going to do is we're going to do an annotation with a whiteboard screen in which everyone will have an opportunity, if you choose, to share what issues matter today. And so when you look at the whiteboard, you can go to the view options if you don't see the toolbar, and you can select a text, you can draw. If someone says something that you agree with, you can use the stamp feature. You can do any color that makes your heart smile. So now I just want to give everyone a moment to think about what issues matter today and to share your thoughts on the whiteboard. So I see equity, educational justice. Are there any others that people would like to share? Anti-racism, health, public health, youth empowerment, community power. Youth and community voice, wealth inequality, and I see a large heart and stars next to anti-racism.
There are people who are saying they're having trouble getting on. You look at the very,
Okay.
very top of your screen that says view options, hit that, then hit annotation, and then a board comes up. And if you hit text, you can then write. I learned that yesterday from Amber.
Thanks, Dom.
Excellent.
Climate justice, mental health, empathy, age friendliness, fair housing, accessibility to services, and Tom, I can't see the chat field. Has everyone that's wanted to share their thoughts, have they placed their items on the whiteboard? Now, I want you to keep these thoughts in mind as we transition to the next activity. And I see identity equity was added, cross-sector collaboration, parenting support, homelessness, livability, and equity, and fair wages. Okay. So with keeping in mind about these items, Jean, I don't have the option to share my poll on here.
I don't know. I don't know how to share an external poll.
Am I made a co-host?
Yeah, you're a co-host.
Okay.
And so you should have the polling option down there, but in that you have to build it in Zoom.
Oh, it's built in Zoom.
Okay, when I'm opening up the poll, there's nothing there.
Yeah, I'm not getting the option on my screen to share the poll within Zoom.
Okay. Yeah, I think that we might be talking about two different things, Amber, because I'm not sure
Okay.
what you're meaning. If you have a link for it, just put the link in the chat.
The poll was created within Zoom, so there's no external link for it.
But was it created in this meeting?
It was created not in this meeting. Then maybe that's what happened.
Yeah. Yeah. If you want to send me the questions, I can do it really quickly.
Okay.
Just email them to me.
All right.
And meanwhile, if you want to chat about something else while I get the poll set up.
Yeah. Are there any other thoughts or any other ideas of what issues are mattering today that anyone would like to share in the chat?
One idea is to add was employment for returning citizens.
And what made you choose that one?
I know, well, I'm here in Chicago and we do help with employment services for my employer, but it's a lack of employment services for returning citizens, especially with cost of living wages, which is a contributor to recidivism.
And then Oya says to add the two she puts on the board, food and housing insecurity and COVID relief. Oya, would you like to share why you chose those items?
Sure. Well, so I've added anti-racism and mental health, And then as I was typing, it ended. So I wanted to add food and housing and COVID relief, especially based on our project at DePaul, looking at students and how much they're struggling with food and housing. And I know that it's not just students who are affected by those issues. And this is especially true in the pandemic. And so it's like it exacerbates already existing difficulties.
Does anyone else?
My most immediate concern is figuring out how to keep people, homeless people, from freezing to death on the streets this winter.
And I see also worried about the nonprofit or healthcare sector growing and eventually commoditizing human being once goods and services fade out as the basis of our economy. Tim, would you like to share more about that?
Sure. Megan pointed out, and I agree with her, that we might already be there, but I just know, in Amber, you and I share some stories here in Cincinnati, and we've talked a lot about it, but I worry about how people with disabilities, homeless, elder, prisoners, etc., get kind of commoditized and they become units of economy. And so we end up producing and farming each other once the products have become automated. So then our jobs in our economy become to consume, produce, and farm each other. I really worry about that.
And Megan, I see that you said you're agreeing and you're definitely saying at least on the path.
Yeah, sorry, I'm eating in the background here. Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of at the crux of the critiques around the nonprofit industrial complex, is like looking at the ways that that's already started, the way that we've already begun to do that, and you know, the ways that sectors of the economy are already applying more of the band-aid surface solutions than looking at the root causes of why is the system the way that it is, which that's why I'm glad you're hosting this conversation.
And Jean, were you able to create the poll?
I only saw one question.
Yep, it's just one question.
Okay, yeah, I've got that.
Yep.
Just a second.
Okay, thank you. So when thinking about the issue or issues that you've chosen, think about how satisfied you are with how the nonprofit sector has tried to address that particular issue. And Jean will launch the poll.
They only could count votes this fast in Georgia.
So it looks like a majority are dissatisfied, or even kind of right in the middle there, and some are very dissatisfied. So it looks like 80% of people have voted. So when thinking, so I'll share the results and we'll stop sharing. So with thinking about, oh, sorry, I got a little tricky with the, so now when you think about the issues that everyone shared and thinking about their satisfaction with the nonprofit sector, it's obvious there's some form of a gap. Resources and systems are not allowing for the issues that are prevalent to be addressed. And so how do we move away from this complex of having nonprofit organizations in place, but there still being a gap? And so I have some thoughts as to why the system is the way it is, and some ideas on how that can be changed to redirect and think about how we think about the nonprofit sector. So essentially, although nonprofits do not have the title of tenure, and it's typically in academia, they actually implement that concept where leaders stay in those positions for a long duration of time. And so if you look at some of the nonprofits that have been here for decades and decades and decades, and they've had the same leader and they're addressing the same issue, there has to be some kind of switch that takes place. Now, granted, there are some organizations in place because of just the way our systems are structured are just going to always be needed. And unfortunately, that's just how the structures have just been designed. But I challenged nonprofits to think about switching up leadership and not having people essentially being able to stay in roles for a long period of time. When you have the same leadership that also impacts culture change or lack thereof, and in a sense can also hinder the momentum that takes place because the freshness of ideas, the newness of strategies is not in place. So essentially, when organizations receive funding, a lot of times it seems like the same ones are getting the same money and doing the same thing. And the same thing is not what's going to move the dial. It's not what's going to move the needle in any form or way. And so when thinking about the nonprofit structure, having an understanding that innovation is key and organizations have to be willing to be able to pivot and change. And so the funding has to do the same and not always eyeing the organizations that people know or connect with already. A lot of times organizations, and I've seen this across the board where, okay, we're gonna get feedback, but we're gonna ask the same people from the same organization to sit at the same table every single time. And the problem with this isn't working. The same people having the same idea at the same table is still having the issues in place that everyone has addressed. So there has to be some form of change in the order of the table, who is at the table, and who's even created the table for people to come give their voices. And if there's not an openness to having this form of diversity, we're going to continue to have the same conversations about what issues are plaguing our communities. Nonprofit sector has to report to a board of directors. By IRS 501c3 standing, you're required to have a board in place that you have to report to. But what is not required is a community advisory board. And what this would consist of is community members collectively coming together to guide the programming of the nonprofit structure. A lot of times this does not take place. And even if it is, sometimes it's treated as a placeholder, as a form, instead of an action item, in which there's so much potential if there was an interest and effort in bringing voices together, and not only just bringing together, but actually taking into account what the voices are saying when specifically it comes to programming that is taking place. So what happens how nonprofits get money? A lot of times there's a funder. The funder has an interest. That interest has money, and nonprofits tend to lean towards that interest of the funder. The problem with that is sometimes the funder's interest is not aligned with community needs. And so what has to happen is that there has to be some form of co-creation with communities, not creating programs that appease a funder whose interests are not aligned with communities. And that has been a traditional thing that has taken place within the nonprofit. I've recalled when I've been in roles where Leadership is like, hey, there's this RFP. Hey, we need a program to meet this. And the program was not already in our wheelhouse. And when looking at data that satisfaction data and things like that, it wasn't even an interest of communities. And in some cases, I've seen nonprofits where they get the big money. And then it's like, oh my gosh, we have this money and community members are not invested or interested in what we have to say. Well, why should they be? There was no interest in co-creating. You decided to create for the funder as opposed to creating for the community. Because if you create with the community, a lot of these issues wouldn't even be prevalent because the solutions are within communities, not within organizations that may or may not be directly interacting with members on a daily basis. A lot of times leadership decides to create programs, and then sometimes those individuals in leadership roles have not done any sort of outreach to even have an understanding from a needs perspective what needs to be done. And so if we flip how this is done and the programming is specifically driven by community voice and from a bottom-up approach, what happens is there is impact. And ideally, there's no need for that program to continue for a long period of time because there was intentionality behind the design of that program. In this era, with so many things that are going on from environmentally, from politically, to various injustices, organizations have chosen to speak or not speak. And I encourage those that are to pay attention to how a nonprofit organization responds during this time. And if there is no response, that speaks a lot, not only just to the nonprofit sector, but what that organizational culture is and how they feel about various things that are happening to those that are most affected and impacted. A lot of times, the focus on nonprofits is numbers. Can you meet this number? And from a program design, from a program evaluation, this is not impact. This is simply reach. And a lot of times programs are not designed to be impactful. They're just designed to bring in some form of a revenue from a funder. And so it's really important that organizations decide to focus on being impactful and not just exposing others to a program that may or may not actually be effective or be what a community wants or needs at that current time. There's no time like the present. And so I think that there is an opportunity from form of action when we're looking at this from those that play a role in the nonprofit sector and not just individuals that work within that sector. So let's, from a nonprofit professionals and practitioners, this is a chance to advocate for community voice in programming and make it be known to those that are in decision-making positions within organizations. That is a way to ideally help in terms of co-creating. Unfortunately, a lot of times nonprofits like that as a buzzword, but are not willing to put in the time that it takes to build that trust and that relationship. And so it is our responsibility, if you're deciding to be in this space, is to share the value that that has. So when someone sees a gap, one of the things, if they don't see the nonprofit existing, or if they don't see an organization in place doing it the way that they see should be done, they create it, right? Well, in turn, another way to think about this is if there are existing organizations that have various strengths being able to come together when it comes to a specific issue, but a lot of times the sector has created this competition among organizations because everyone is competing for the same pot of money. And so there is this fear of actually coming together and establishing partnerships. When it comes to an inclusive culture, a lot of times when you hear the terms diversity, equity, inclusion, and access, the focus is on race, but there are other aspects that have to be explored to even build this culture of inclusiveness. It's beyond race. It's also looking at accessibility, looking at ability, looking at gender, looking at wage gaps and inequities between the incomes of leaders versus those that are not in those C-suite roles, so to speak. And so it's important to create this culture to which everyone feels that their voice matters, that they have a part in the movement and the positioning of this sector. And this culture change is not easy. It's one of those things that a lot of organizations are attempting to do now. You may have seen an increase in individuals posting roles that focus on DEI work. And what that shows is a couple of things. And it's hard to necessarily define what the reason was behind that role. But there's a couple things to think about. If that role is being offered, there is some form of a culture issue. The role could be offered to ideally address this gap or to appease individuals that are paying attention to the actions of nonprofit organizations. It's hard to say which way organizations are falling when it comes to that, but we have to pay attention to these roles and how we can leverage those roles to not only create an inclusive work culture, but also be able to create a culture to which it's acceptable for community voice to be used when it comes to thinking about the nonprofit sector. For those that are in academia, there are things that can be done, simply collaborating with community members on research initiatives. A lot of times what happens in the academic sector, institutions get a large pot of money to implement a project. A third of that goes to the university, and even less of that goes to the community directly. And so when partnering with communities on research initiatives, it's important to think about their salary as well, not just the institutions to which you are being connected with. And this will help in terms of addressing any sort of financial inequities within that organization and the communities that they're serving, but also to build trust and partnerships and it not be this considered this top-down approach. There's also opportunities to serve on advisory boards or nonprofit board. And this is a way for those that have an academic background that are community focused and centric in their mindset to help to transform some of the practices and policies within existing organizations. A lot of times there are people that are just not familiar with this work and how to engage with communities. And so there may be an interest, but there's no expertise. And so I encourage those that have this expertise, but are coming from an academic background, to collaborate with organizations in this capacity. And there are so many communities that are in need of just the resources of academic institutions. And so having that partnership helps them with things like prospect research for grant writing, literature reviews that can be used for some of the justification and needs for nonprofit programming. And so if there's this leverage of resources and collaboration across the board, across different sectors, the power that is within that is something that will allow us to ideally move the needle when it comes to impact. For individuals that are within the development space or that are funders, I encourage creating opportunities that directly support community needs. Yes, all funders have a funding focus, but when you think about that focus, also think about the needs that are relevant and how your focus can or cannot specifically address that need. Just as with any grant application or RFP, there are a list of things that you have to be in adherence to even get money, from having your 501c3, having your board in place, making sure you have the budget item. But one thing I have not seen that would be encouraging for funders to consider is setting a standard of grantees that requires community voice to be in the programming that you are proposing in terms of seeking funding. And what happens when you set a standard? One of three things happens. You either meet the standard, exceed the standard, or you're nowhere near the standard. And so for those organizations that choose to not attempt to meet or exceed, won't receive funding for programming that is mediocrely designed to address community needs. And the power that is within funders is that they are considered a resource for so many different organizations. And organizations are depending on that funding to implement the programming that is essential right now. And so this is also an opportunity to say, hey, if you are not having community voice a part of this, if when you're applying for this grant application, there's not a community partner, and when you're looking at your budget item, that there is not a big gap between both of the organizations, these are the type of items that could be included in a form of rubrics to help ensure that funders are setting a standard that will allow organizations to soar. A lot of times there is this consistency among funding larger organizations because they have that history, they have that capacity. But those organizations essentially may have missed a gap or are unable to fill a gap because of how they are structured. And so you have smaller organizations that are being developed, that are doing on the ground work, but because they don't have that history and because they don't have that reputation, it's harder for them to get funds. So this is an opportunity to look at those organizations and help leverage what they are trying to do and meeting some of the gaps that the larger organizations have not been able to meet. Because if they were able to meet them, they wouldn't exist. Supporting an inclusive culture. Within grant applications, one thing that has been coming out more and more is looking at the diversity of boards. And so asking how many of your board members are women or have racial or equity sort of things. But what about diving deeper into that and funders asking organizations, what is the gap between your lowest paid employee and your highest paid employee? How many of the leaders within your organizations are coming directly from communities that you serve? How many of the leadership roles that are in place, how many of those are given to maybe internal candidates? And so when you dive deeper in having that expectation of an inclusive culture, that will instill in organizations to step up their game, essentially. Funders have that opportunity to write what their expectations are. And so those expectations can be as rigid or as flexible as they choose. And so now, seeing that there's so many inequities that exist, asking more questions about organizational culture, it's critical during this time. And as I mentioned, community partnerships are vital, and sort of dismantling this thought of, oh my gosh, we have to compete for the same money. So as a funder, there is an expectation that if you're going to apply for funds from us as a funder, that you must have this community partnership. That will help dismantle some of the traditional things that have consistently taken place within the nonprofit structure, which have been a challenge. So essentially, it is time to really evaluate nonprofits from thinking about mission and programming and impact. So for example, with CEC, the initial goal was really to improve face-to-face community engagement with people, because there was so much of this dependency on virtual and cell phones and things like that. And so we tried to create programming that allow people to connect. And when COVID hit, that was not going to be the way that we would be able to do programming. And so as an organization, we realized we had to shift, and we had to think about our mission in a different way. Think about it in a way that will allow us to engage not just in person, but also virtually, and really focus on building this human-centric connections, because right now, this is a time where so many people are feeling isolated and disengaged and disconnected. And so what happens when you have to switch your mission, since we are no longer having a mission of face-to-face, that means programming has to change. So that means thinking about what would a virtual programming look like. One of the ways we did that was by hosting the first virtual MPA Scrawl conference. And we saw a gap in saying, okay, this conference is not going to take place in person, and there is nothing on the table that is saying we're going to try to implement this virtually. And so it was critical to recognizing, one, that need, and being in a position to change and pivot the programming to meet that specific need. And so then that allows us to think about impact differently, and to think about it in a way that allows us to be intentional about how we think about programming and the things that we do as a nonprofit sector, and as things that we do for those of us that are maybe not in the nonprofit sector, but we're interacting, whether it's a funder, whether it's an academia, whether it's a consultant as a practitioner. So question to the panel, to our esteemed attendees: what should be the goal of nonprofit organizations? Would anyone like to share any thoughts? And you can just take yourself off on mute and share any thought that you may have.
Systems change.
Systems change?
Yep.
Does anyone else have any thoughts on what the goal should be? Ideally, if you're impactful, you're no longer needed. And so if you're no longer needed, there's no need to have that organization in existence. And a lot of times, the culture of the nonprofit is focusing on growing and expanding and getting more money. And when you have that mindset of growth and not on direct impact, there's going to be this gap and this disconnect. And yes, as I mentioned, some organizations they're going to always be needed until there are system changes in place, right? But for those that have the opportunity and the potential to go away and not be as relevant, this is the time to really assess that. If you think about nonprofit organizations that you know, they've been around for decades. And then the question I have to ask, why is that? Because if they had a specific mission, are they not meeting that mission? Because if they were meeting that mission, would they be needed? And so I think it's important to reassess how we think about the nonprofit sector, and not only how we think about it, but also how we choose to engage. And whether that's being in a volunteer capacity, or being as a staff member, or choosing to work on community-centered projects with organizations. The question should be, how are you trying to not be in existence? And if there are no responses to that, and there hasn't been thought around that, then there won't be any intentionality behind that. And so now I will take any questions. Did anyone have any thoughts that they were questions they would like to ask?
Tim has his hand up.
Oh, I was just applauding, but
Oh.
I think that was terrific, Amber. I would say also not just systems change, but culture change. And the thing that you really highlighted here that I think is really just hitting for me is, you know, it seems like nonprofits are performing triage. We're the emergency room of culture. And accidentally, we're also part of the culture, right? So our systems and our structures are coming out of the general culture, which then re-hurt or wound vulnerable, marginalized outsiders, whatever we want to consider less thans. So I think that that's what we're trying to get to is culture change. And that means we have to step out of it. And one thing that's real bright for me today after you saying it is we got to start listening at the level of not outcomes that aren't necessarily vocalized, right? We got to pay attention to who is not getting enough social oxygen, and how do we address that versus just at that. They're not going to tell it on the survey, but they'll show it through their life. I just really appreciate you highlighting that.
And it's really important for us to figure out ways to engage differently. And because the same type of engagement has gotten us in the same predicament that we're in, to where there are issues and there are gaps that are not being filled. Does anyone else have any comments or questions they would like to share?
I'd be interested to hear how you've been putting some of these ideas into practice within your own nonprofit.
So a couple of strategies that I have done. So one of them being is that if a programming received feedback that was not in the most positive way from a community standpoint, then it's eliminated. And so I'll give you an example of that. Our first pilot program, Family Flickin', had a good community response. However, party buses are not accessible for individuals of various abilities, and especially within the location that I am at. And so even though I've gotten requests to implement, as an organization, made the decision that not going to do that same initiative in that way. If the party buses are not accessible, then we're not going to use that vehicle as a mechanism to bring people together within their communities around movies, because essentially it disconnects with their values of inclusiveness. Another example of, and I say this all the time to individuals, my goal is to not be needed within an organization, and to ideally, however this organization is molded and shaped, the goal is to close and go away. And so I say that consistently in public spaces to, one, be held accountable, and two, to be able to encourage others to think about their organizations in that stand and that frame of mind, is to Let's focus on doing things that we need to do to learn what we need to learn. And then let's take those learnings, learn, apply, and let's slowly go away. So then we can leverage ourselves around issues that need more support. Thank you for your question. That's a good question.
Thanks for sharing.
I wonder how many people have actually seen organizations set up something that's going to put them out of business. I know it's been said for the 40, 50 years I've been in the nonprofit world, everybody sets it as a goal, but how often have we ever seen someone actually do that? And maybe you've seen it, and if not, what does that say to us about what has to be done? Because if it's the right goal and it's not happening, what's that about? Is that a fair question?
Yeah, and I think that is rooted in fear. And the structure was not, if you look just looking at the history of nonprofit structures in general, it wasn't designed to go away. It was designed to stay and figure out ways how we can stay longer and make more money. And so I think when you think about the structure in a different way, and I think the fear also comes with there's job loss. There's other things that happens when an organization goes away. And yes, that's going to happen. But then thinking about, okay, well, this organization is going away and there's all these assets in terms of the staffing that people bring to the table. What happens if those same people are able to work collectively around another issue that's needing to move the needle? And that's just not how leaders are leading organizations.
Amber, I have a question. Oh.
I was just going to say, we have an example here in Cincinnati that Amber and I are connected to, the People's Liberty Project, right? It was 5 years, I think they sunsetted.
Yep. And so that project funded individuals who had ideas as opposed to going to organizations. And so they made the decision of, we're going to fund all these different individuals to do these projects for 5 years. And after 5 years, we're done. That's that. And they assessed whether or not, what would this look like going forward? Should there be another one? And what the conclusion was, the power, the impact, and the intentionality behind the work that so many individuals did during that time cannot be replicated. So the leaders of People's Liberty decided, we're going to go away. We came in to do what we said we were going to do. A lot of people that did their projects have gone on to either leverage that project in another way, partner with other organizations, start movements, start collaboratives, start collectives. And so the leverage and the momentum that was had during that time, it's still there. It just looks different. And there's this fear of what impact the nonprofit sector would look like if it looked different.
Oh yeah, you want to finish your question?
Oh, and I see some questions too in the chat too as well. Oh yeah, were you finished with your question? Oh yeah, were you finished with your question? I think you're frozen.
She's frozen.
Okay. Another question from Judah. What do you think is an ideal time frame? Enough time to make an impact, but not so long as to become calcified? That's a great question. I think starting small, as opposed to, I think if you look at strategic plans, a lot of times within organizations, there are these 10 years, there are these, 5 years. What happens when you have a smaller plan and work with smaller plans and meet your measurements and your objectives in that plan? And I think it's going to vary by issue, but I think if organizations started looking at their strategic plans at a shorter time frame first and learn and master that before saying, oh, this is what we're going to look like in 10 years. That doesn't mean that's what the community needs is going to be in 10 years. So you're sitting here thinking about a plan that's probably not going to make sense. So if your plan was actually to do it in smaller chunks and focus on that smaller time frame first, then that impact in 10 years is going to look totally different. And let's see. What types of resistance? Oh, yes. Judah? Yes.
No, I was just saying thanks for your thoughts on that.
Oh, no problem. Let's see. And I have another question. Let's see. What types of resistance is perceived from other nonprofit leaders when you have conversations with them around the idea of structuring the organization and work to become obsolete? I get looks that are not pleasant when I have said this in public forums. And so how I've taken it as, I've just chosen to sort of use the vehicle of CEC as a way to show you that it can be done. Mm-hmm. And so, because that way you can't say, oh, this never has happened before. Yeah, here's an example. Here's an example, and here's what can happen. And it would be nice if other organizational leaders said the same thing and did the same thing. So then we would have a collective of nonprofit organizations that decided to come in, do the work that was needed, and go away. Let's see, how might the structures embedded within the nonprofit complex need to change to make organizations more effective? For example, limits on time a nonprofit can exist, requirements that they provide evidence of impact, certain representation on boards. These were all great in terms of thinking about the culture change that would be needed to make organizations more effective. I think if organizations were held at an accountability level, not just from a funder, but also from communities too, and saying, this is what we expect. This is what the engagement looks like. Because when you look at where a lot of the money comes from to run organizations, a lot of it is donations from individuals. Grants and things, they make a smaller piece of that pie. And so that connection, that is critical for organizations being able to even generate funds. And so if there was a standard of, hey, you need to have these sort of DEIA rubric requirements, and they need to be in place before you can get more money. Because here's the thing, if your culture inside your organization is not right, how does that translate when you're looking at community impact? There's a disconnect. And so if more people set standards for how, when they're thinking about who you're giving your money to when it comes to organizations, and just being vocal about what you expect from an organization, that you are essentially giving maybe your time, your talent, your efforts, and even the board diversity. A lot of times when you look at the board makeup does not align with the community makeup. That is a big gap. With the board, essentially, it's either give, get off, or give, get, or get off the board. And some organizations adhere to that and others don't. But not only should that be a factor in terms of, okay, their job is to generate money, but what about using the community advisory board to understand what's going on? A part of the work that I do, I attend different community council meetings within Cincinnati. I can't say that that's a part of the structure of other organizations, of whether they're taking the time to actually go and understand and learn. And so if that's not a part of whether it's a staff member or you're programming or you're designing, then that's a problem as well. So I think there has to be more accountability on the internal structures and the internal culture of those that are externally supporting organizations.
Well, we're really getting heated up, and now it's 2 o'clock. So you hit a note in terms of people's work and the critical issues that happen when you work with nonprofits. So Amber, thank you very much for this presentation. Great job.
Thank you. Thank you everyone for joining and for participating.
And let me just ask while we have everybody here. I've been talking to someone for next month, but I'm not certain that's going to come through. So if you or if you know someone want to present something, let me know.
Hey, Tom.
Yeah.
At some point, I think the community psych program at National Louis, certainly Tiffany, Judah, myself, and maybe some students would like to talk about the concept of a practice dissertation, as opposed to the typical traditional research dissertation. And we'd love to get people's feedback and ideas. So there's, even within our program, there's some controversy around it. So we're trying to do this right. We've got one student who's kind of piloting it. So at some point that would be great if we could do that.
So is there some interest in having a open discussion on a practice dissertation? Everybody doesn't have their thumbs up. Okay, that's good. That gives me some idea. The other one that I was going to raise is the national discussion now that everybody says is because of the 75 million versus 70 million, is we have bridges that have to be crossed so that we start to listen to each other and respect each other. And bridging divides is a major issue. It seems to me that's a community psychology issue, but I'm hard put to find many examples. Do we know some? Do we have something to contribute to that? Is that worth an open discussion? What does community psychology have to contribute to the issue of bridging divides in this country? Don't see a lot of hands on that one. Okay. Well, we'll get something out to you. And Brad, would you be ready for next month? Or did we lose him? We lost him. Tiffany, maybe you can check back with.
Oh yeah, I can ask. Yeah, but the
Yeah.
topic you brought up sounds good too, Tom. I mean, I don't have a person or a solution in mind, but
Well, we could do it as an open discussion.
Yeah,
I actually have someone who does that for work. I could see if she'd be willing to talk a little bit.
be part of the discussion. Yeah.
Okay. Amber, again, thank you so much. Thank you all for signing up. I just repeat what was said at the beginning. We're getting 30 people plus to each of these monthly events, and people are looking at the recorded sessions in very large numbers, 60, 70, 80, 280. So this is, serving some function in the institution that we'd like to keep going. So come get me ideas, get me people who volunteer yourself. And thank you all for coming, and thanks again to Amber. Very provocative discussion. We all work in the nonprofit world, and you really laid out some of the dilemmas. Thank you all. Be well.
Thanks,
Thank you, Tom.
everyone.
Thanks,
Amber.
everyone. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.